Okay. Well, first I want to thank everyone who helped organize this conference. I actually helped organize one hacker conference once, and it takes an enormous amount of work. And so it's really wonderful to be here. So what I'm going to do today, and maybe we can pull up, I'll pull up my slides. All right. So I think the title is a bit self-explanatory. It's called How Anonymous Narrowly Evaded the Terrorism Rhetorical Machine. And some of you might be wondering, like, what does this have to do with me or InfoSec? And I will say that there's really just a couple of points of intersection, but nevertheless, I think that this is an interesting phenomena coming out of the sort of hacker and geek world. But a little later on in the talk, I'll make some of the connections. But first, a little bit about myself. So Pierre David mentioned I'm an anthropologist. And who here knows an anthropologist, actually, personally? Okay, very few people. Well, so usually when I tell people, like an accountant or a doctor, that I'm an anthropologist, two things come to mind: Indiana Jones or dinosaurs. And I'm not joking here, actually. And so I usually have to disappoint people and explain that I don't go anywhere fancy to dig for dinosaurs or temples. I dig other things. I dig people. And that's what anthropologists do. They focus on the study of living cultures and people. And for better or for worse, I've dedicated about, 15 years of my life to the study of hackers. And that means I spend a lot of time at events like this and on the computer. And my first project was on Debian, and so I studied Linux. And so it's one of the few kind of drugs in the world that actually improves your life. And then for the last 5 or 6 years, I've worked on Anonymous. And this has been the basis, these two projects, of 2 books. And I don't know if Pierre David has told you, but we are giving away a bunch of books at the conference. And actually, I have 2 trivia questions during my talk. And if anyone gets the right answer, I'll give you a book right here. So keep that in mind. All right, so enough about me. I'm here to talk about Anonymous. And Anonymous is interesting because in some ways it is a political movement today that's a little bit difficult to define. And that's so because it's been used by so many different groups and individuals around the world to engage in very different forms of activism, from street protests to hacking to denial of service attacks. Now, there's a lot of specific words I've used over the years to describe Anonymous. And some of them are Hydra, the mythical Greek figure of one body with many snake heads, tricksters, confusing, enchanting, controversial, irreverent, unpredictable, frustrating, and stupid. These are all different words I've used to describe Anonymous over the years. But one thing that I rarely have to do is argue against the idea that Anonymous are terrorists, are cyber terrorists. And I'm surprised by this. I actually thought that when Anonymous started to especially engage in some of its more risky forms of hacking and sabotage, I thought the label cyberterrorism was going to be placed on Anonymous pretty much almost immediately. And let me explain why. Well, there's probably no surprise, but while there are terrorists in the world, the terrorism label can also be used for political ends. It can be used to smash dissent. And I'm going to give you a number of examples. So before I go there, I just want to draw on one book, which is really wonderful, which I really think captures the way in which, especially in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States, this phenomena also is relevant in France, Spain, and other places. But in the United States, the word terrorism really has been used as a political tool. Since September 11th, the word terrorism has been stretched and pulled and hemmed and cuffed and torn and mended to fit a growing body of political whims. And this is from a book about environmental activists and animal rights activists who I think have really been the victims, especially in the United States, of this kind of political power game. But it's not just animal rights activists, which I'm going to get to. Who here uses Tor? Okay, as to be expected. So a lot of you might be tourists. So the former NSA Director General Keith Alexander has stated that all those communicating with encryption will be regarded as terror suspects and will be monitored and stored as a method of prevention, right? So this is probably familiar to most people. But again, I think it's really the animal rights activists who engage in forms of arson, sabotage to liberate animals who have been most successfully labeled terrorists. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background on the animal rights activists because I think it helps us understand why Anonymous was in many ways so susceptible to this. So in 2004, John Lewis, the Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, declared in testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, he said, "The FBI's investigation of animal rights extremists and eco-terrorism matters is our highest domestic terrorism investigative priority." Now, what's really interesting about this priority is that some of the arrests that happened soon after this statement occurred with a group of 7 activists who only ran a website for the animal rights activists. They didn't engage in any animal liberation. They did not engage in any sabotage. They did not engage in any arson. They simply ran a website because in the animal rights activism world, there's a strict division. If you're going in to liberate the minks and the foxes, you never run the website. If you're running the website, you never do the acts of sabotage, right? But those people who ran the website were jailed for many, many years, actually, simply because they advertised what was going on with the animal rights activists. So this is my first trivia question. What was the name of the group of the 7 who eventually became 6, but in the title there are 7, of these animal rights activists who were jailed in the United States for many years for simply running a website? I know this was a hard one, given this is not an animal rights conference, but no one? All right, I have other trivia questions. So it was the SHAC 7, S-H-A-C. The SHAC 7 were convicted under the Animal Enterprise Act for campaigning to shut down the notorious animal testing lab, Huntington Life Sciences. The campaign of the SHAC 7 didn't involve anthrax, pipe bombs, or a plot to hijack an airplane. They ran a website. On that website, they posted news about the campaign, legal actions like protests, and illegal actions like stealing animals from labs, and unabashedly supported all of it. Since the federal government has largely been unable to catch groups like the Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front, prosecutors went after lawful activists in the spotlight. And again, to be clear, many of these people spent 2-3 years in jail for running a website. Now, what's interesting was right as this case was going on, the U.S. government felt that the laws and the book were not powerful enough to go after animal rights activists. So this Animal Enterprise Protection Act in 2006 became the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So it became an explicit terrorism law. And in fact, when the SHAC 7, who were really then eventually 6, appealed their case, they had to appeal their case in relation to this terrorism law. And now any animal rights activists, for example, this just happened recently, where a pair of animal rights activists who released some minks from a farm. At first, they were imprisoned by state law. And in 2013, they pled guilty to state charges of possessing burglary tools, and they did 5 months and 30 months. And then prosecution in 2014 said, oh, and now we're going to try you under the Federal Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. and they got an additional number of years and months. So this is the context. I think this is important because while certainly animal rights activists do engage in sabotage, it's important to note that out of the over 5,000 crimes that have been documented by researchers who study animal rights activists, as you can see, there have been 0 assassinations, no murders, right? So most of what they do is vandalism, harass individuals who work at these labs, and liberate animals. Now, as I mentioned, this kind of tagging of terrorists to activists is not simply something that happens in the United States. In France, there is a group called the Tarnac 9 who engaged in a pretty spectacular act of sabotage where they decided to kind of shut down the railway trains in France. And they've been charged with conspiracy for terrorism. And it's a complicated case where the terrorism charge was dropped, but now the prosecution is seeking to reinstantiate the terrorism charge. What's also interesting is that the Tarnac 9 were labeled pre-terrorists. Maybe this will be another trivia question. Why were they labeled pre-terrorists? Okay, because they didn't have cell phones. No cell phones, that makes you pre-terrorist. So basically, the point is monkey wrench or saboteur are now the same as terrorists. So that's the background. Now I really want to move to anonymous. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, you know what? I actually think anonymous are terrorists. I think they've been labeled terrorists. So first, I need to convince you that they have not been labeled terrorists. So why do I think that kind of label has failed to be used, or it's been used on occasion? Why has it not stuck? Okay, first of all, most news articles refer to them as activists or hacktivists, with very few referring to them as terrorists or even a dark, evil menace. The most negative word is vigilante. Now again, most of these news articles are not necessarily pro-anonymous, they're not positive, but they're not labeling them terrorists. So that's kind of one data point. Another data point is an odd one. So about every few weeks, I get an email from a very enthusiastic high school student or middle school student who's writing a report about Anonymous or who's interested in Anonymous. And basically, they're writing to me as an expert to ask some questions, and they, again, treat them as kind of activists. And my sense is that if they had been successfully labeled as cyber terrorists, I would be maybe getting emails from students, but they would be asking about terrorism and not about activism. And the most remarkable email I got was from a middle school student, I think he was 13 or 12, from Peru in South America. And he made the following video about Anonymous. So I'm going to show you a short clip of his video, which I think is representative of how many people, not everyone, but how some people view Anonymous. So again, keep in mind this was made by a 13-year-old.
What do you, the audience, think hacktivism is? Well, hacktivism is defined by searchsecurity.techtarget.com as the act of hacking or breaking into a computer system for a politically or socially motivated cause. You might think it's just people videotaping themselves in Guy Fawkes masks, ranting on the internet against organizations and governments. But if you have been paying attention, you know that hacktivists have changed the world. For better or worse, they have been taking on powerful organizations like MasterCard, Visa, the US Justice Department, and even the CIA under certain circumstances. Well, if you're in Peru and think that it doesn't affect you or your country, think again. In March of 2015, Anonymous Peru posted the quote-unquote tango down on its Twitter feed, several minutes after it had shut down the municipality of Lima website in protest of the mayor who had painted over artistic murals with yellow paint. It took the city more than 8 hours to restore the site. Before that, in December of 2014, the same group of anonymous Peru hacked 4 municipalities outside of Lima, in the departments of Huancayo, Huancavelica, and Apurímac. More hacktivism occurred in May when anonymous Peru posted a porno video on the Ministry of Economy and Finance's website to protest the government's support of the Tia Maria mining project in Moquegua. Gabriella Coleman.
Oh, all right, that's where I have to stop. Well, what I like about the video, first of all, again, is that a 13-year-old made it for his class. It also just gives you a little bit of a window into the fact that actually one of the really interesting characteristics of Anonymous is that it's quite global. You know, what we tend to know about Anonymous has to do with Europe or the English-speaking world, but actually there's been remarkable activity in Peru, in Indonesia, in the Philippines. And in many ways, there's a lot of kind of differences because very different groups take on Anonymous, but there's also some similarities, such as an embrace of kind of the offensive culture, i.e. Posting porn on a defaced website. So that's my other data point. My third data point about why I think Anonymous hasn't been kind of pegged as cyber terrorists has to do with the absolute proliferation of TV shows and films that are representing Anonymous or something like Anonymous, inspired by Anonymous, in pretty positive ways. And even when there's negative elements, they're not portrayed as cyber terrorists. So the most famous of these is Mr. Robot, which is now going to start again, a new season. And there's some, very explicit references to Anonymous in that show. One of my favorite movies that came out in 2014 in Germany is also kind of semi-inspired by Anonymous. There's a group called Clay. The movie's called Who Am I? There's a group called Clay who, in some ways, they're trying to outdo Lulsec. And again, they're kind of portrayed in a very positive way. It's even made it into films you'd never expect hacker references to enter into, such as a film about these geeks in the hood in LA called Dope, which is a great film. It's a dope film. And there's all these references actually to Bitcoin and Lulsec and Aaron Swartz. So this is important because Anonymous is being represented in a kind of positive way in popular culture. All right, now for another trivia that I think hopefully someone will get. So I've mentioned Dope, Who Am I, and Mr. Robot. What other TV shows has Anonymous popped up in? Okay. All right, you win a book. Do you want a French book or an English book? Okay. All right. How about there's other shows? You're welcome. Any other shows? How about if I give a hint? It's based in Washington, D.C. House of Cards, exactly. And in fact, there was someone from Anonymous who was the consultant. And there were even references to people like Barrett Brown, who's going to come up later in my talk. And there's a few other shows as well, like The Good Wife, Anonymous, is a reference to. So I think we're good with the trivia. All right. So this is why I think actually Anonymous hasn't been labeled successfully as cyber terrorists. But now I want to kind of return to this question as to why they were in such a good position to be labeled cyber terrorists. And not simply, I had kind of introduced the more general reason, i.e. this label is used for political purposes. But let's get into the world of Anonymous and cyberterrorism to kind of, again, revisit why I think Anonymous was in a good position to be labeled. Well, first of all, there's this long-standing cyber warfare and cyberterrorism frame, right? We hear these all the time by security researchers, the government. And what I think is actually fascinating about this frame of cyberterrorism is how long it has existed for. So one of the kind of first references to cyberterrorism occurred in 1991. And it was a report called Computers at Risk, Safe Computing in the Information Age. And this is what it says. We are at risk. Increasingly, America depends on computers. They control power, delivery, communications, aviation, financial services, and it goes on and on. The last sentence is the important part. Tomorrow's terrorists may be able to do more damage with a keyboard than with a bomb, right? So this is a frame that has existed, and then it only intensified after 9/11, and Cyber Pearl Harbor is the kind of, term that everyone here is familiar with. So this is one reason. I think that they could have been slotted into this more particular frame. Now, another reason has to do with Anonymous itself. I don't think that they're terrorists, but they certainly are involved in high-risk hacking and sabotage. And here I'll actually quote Cory Doctorow, who's a science fiction writer, and he wrote a review of my book, and I think he captured this kind of tendency to do this kind of high-risk hacking in a very poetic way when he wrote, "And the kind of hacking that Anonymous does by means of the fluid, structureless norms of the group, half macho posturing, half uber-savvy media prankstership, is doubly exciting, or exciting squared. It's filled with drama, betrayals, police informants, intimidation, brinkmanship, insane risk-taking, and impassioned speeches from the battlements." Now, for those that need a little bit of a refresher course on Anonymous and its history, very briefly, originally it was a name used for pure trolling. It was the internet hate machine. There was a lot of pranks that were orchestrated under the name. But in 2008, there was a transformation where Anonymous started to be used for political purposes. And I won't go into the history, it's a really fascinating one. But in 2011, what we started to see under the name Anonymous is quite a bit of this high-risk hacking, especially the summer of 2011. LulzSec went on a 50-day hacking spree where they hacked a corporation every day. Anti-Sec was a more militant version of LulzSec. LulzSec was doing it for the fun. Anti-Sec was doing it to say, like, a total fuck you to the government and corporations. They hacked into NATO. They told the FBI to fuck off every single week. So this was pretty heavy stuff. This was the period I actually became very paranoid and was pretty sure that the FBI was either going to knock on my door or that they had owned my computer, right? And so this was, in specific, the time where I really thought that association was going to be made. Now, I'm going to get to one instance where I think the government made this attempt to make that association. They did it in a very interesting way and failed. But before I get there, another kind of reason why I think the association was ripe, not only for making, because again, some people made it, but for sticking, was precisely because some people did make the association. And probably the most famous person who made the association between Anonymous and terrorism was Greg Hugland. He was the CEO of HB Gary. Who here knows about the hack against HB Gary? So some people are smiling because it's quite an incredible story. Let me just read his quote and then very briefly tell you what happened. He says, they're causing a great deal of pain right now. What they're doing now is not hacktivism, it is terrorism. They've really crossed the line here. I've worked so many years on HB Gary, and I don't deserve this. I never did anything to these people. They completely overreacted to the Financial Times article. Why did they need to do that? Well, briefly, for those that don't know the story, one of the employees of HB Gary, Aaron Barr, had supposedly infiltrated Anonymous and had identified the key operatives, had unmasked Anonymous. And then he went to a reporter working for the Financial Times and boasted, I know the names of the key people, and I'm going to go to the FBI. First of all, he was actually wrong. He did not have the key names. And when Anonymous read the article, which was published on a Friday morning, well, the hackers that evening basically completely owned HB Gary. They downloaded all the company emails, put them on the Pirate Bay, deleted everything, right? And took over Aaron Barr's Twitter account and started spewing really offensive stuff. And this is what he's talking about. And it gives you a sense of just kind of how crazy some of their hacks were. Now, this was a bit of an unusual revenge hack that didn't follow the logic of what they tended to do, but nevertheless gives you a sense of what they were up to. Okay, so another reason why I think the association was ripe for making it stick was the US government, again, they were not really labeling Anonymous as terrorists explicitly, but there was one hacker in particular, Jeremy Hammond, who's doing a 10-year jail sentence, who was labeled as a terrorist by the US government. This is him. Hammond put on terrorism watch list. But you know what's interesting about that watch list? It was not like a hacktivist terrorism watch list. He was on the watch list because he was an environmentalist and an anarchist. It has to do with that green scare that I talked about earlier, right? So they considered him, possibly a terrorist, but not because he was a hacker, but because he was an anarchist and an environmentalist. Now, another kind of reason why, I think the government could have made that association was because, they really don't like Anonymous, right? That's clear in the arrests. And one of my favorite examples of how the government in Europe and the United States dislikes Anonymous comes from GCHQ, the British version of the NSA. Thanks to the Snowden leaks, we know that they don't totally love Tor, and they certainly don't like Anonymous. And so this is a slide that came from the leaks. And basically, there's some elements which are good, some of which are bad. And here we see that Anonymous is listed in the bad segment. Okay, now I have one final example of how and when the government actually did try to label Anonymous as terrorists, although they did it in a kind of roundabout manner. And it concerns a Wall Street Journal article that was published February 21st, 2012. It reported that General Keith Alexander, who was then the director of the NSA, he basically debriefed people in a secret meeting, and he claimed that Anonymous, and this is now a direct quote from the article, could have the ability within the next year or two to bring about a limited power outage through a cyber attack. So this was published in a very reputable newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. And although the T word was never used here, nevertheless, by sort of saying, well, Anonymous, is going to have the capability to do this, and by association, it kind of seems to suggest they want to do it. This is a way to kind of link terrorism to Anonymous. But the interesting thing about this is that this article actually was very unconvincing. And after it was published, there was a slew of other articles in very reputable establishment papers like NBC News, where security professionals, much like yourselves, actually said, you know what, there's no evidence that they want to do this, that they have this capability. Yes, the power grid is vulnerable, but this just doesn't have any evidence, and there was no evidence given in this article. So that's a little bit of background, again, why I think the association was ripe for making, and there was these attempts. But now I want to move for really the rest of the talk as to why these attempts, however kind of minor they were, why they failed. Why Anonymous, I think, really is understood as controversial, activist, and not a cyber terrorist. So there's many reasons, and I'll start with one that has to do with timing and who Anonymous supported in its early activist history. So one of the major campaigns that made Anonymous prominent had to do with a form of censorship that was slapped onto WikiLeaks. When WikiLeaks released a bunch of diplomatic cables in November 2010, they were provided by Chelsea Manning. Visa, MasterCard, Amazon, they pulled the plug. They stopped providing services for Amazon. One journalist tweeted about this and said, of what have either Assange or WikiLeaks actually been convicted that allows Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Amazon to withdraw services this week, right? Well, this was a pretty big move, and this was a big move. The government the US government informally asked these companies to pull the plug, and they did so because they were incredibly pissed off that Assange had released his diplomatic cables. In fact, the government was so pissed off that certain government officials, such as Sarah Palin, associated Assange with terrorism when she said Assange should be hunted down with the same urgency we pursue al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders. So the government was not happy. There was this form of censorship, and Anonymous reared into action and basically coordinated a very, very large distributed denial of service attack against PayPal and MasterCard. And what's interesting about this event is that even though the hacker community is extremely divided over the use of DDoS, there were certain people, such as Richard Stallman from the Free Software Foundation, who came out in support of this event. There were 7,000 people that showed up on the IRC channel. There was nearly 100,000 downloads of low-orbit ion cannon. This was something that, again, even though a lot of hackers do not like Anonymous, nevertheless, I think that there was a lot of support for this campaign. And what's interesting was that when the mainstream news was reporting on this campaign, there were certain people who tended to actually interpret what Anonymous did not as cyber warfare or terrorism, but as civil disobedience. So what I'm going to show you now is a clip from CNN, which reported on this event.
The new 8 o'clock on CNN. Parker Spitzer, weeknights on CNN.
Here's the real meaning of WikiLeaks' story: the powerlessness of world government and institutions in the internet era. In the last few days, supporters of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange have launched Operation Payback, shutting down major websites like Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. One of the alleged perpetrators is all of 16 years old.
Nick O'Mealy is the perfect person to speak to this new wild, wild net. He's been on the cutting edge of social media and politics. He ran Howard Dean's 2004 presidential internet campaign and teaches about technology and government at Harvard's Kennedy School. It seems a little bit scary to me that anybody can organize an attack on an institution and shut them down. What does that mean?
It's almost like a sit-in, right? I mean, anybody could go sit in the lobby of a bank and shut the bank down for an hour.
That's a fascinating metaphor. I've never even thought about it this way, but it really isn't. I mean, this is a few people. First of all, sit-in requires many people. Second of all, it only shuts down that one little branch. This was right at the heart of the Internet's infrastructure for major global institutions, and they went kaput. And how many people did it take to organize this?
Well, it took a few people to organize it, but hundreds of thousands to participate. It's a denial of service attack. What they do is they get lots of people to all request the website at the same time, and they figure out ways of automating it, but it's still a broad, coordinated activity. PayPal shuts down WikiLeaks' account, but you can still give money through PayPal to the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, this was a political action these hackers took, an act of civil disobedience.
So is this something we should admire?
I absolutely think it's something we should admire. You know, they're standing up for a political value they believe in, which is a radical free speech on the internet. I'd argue maybe it's the only value the internet actually has.
You say you admire them. How far does that go? I mean, cyber war is the new frontier. China is hacking in. China could shut down our grid. Where do you draw the line of what's permissible?
I mean, I wouldn't equate this with cyber war. I don't want,
Why not?
Well, because I don't know that they broke any laws, right?
Well,
all they did was show up.
All they did was show up. All they did.
I love that clip. There's like the good cop, bad cop with the newscasters. There's a bunch of lies in there. There weren't 100,000 people who showed up, or hundreds of thousands. They didn't hit at the critical heart of infrastructure. In fact, it was the PayPal blog that was taken down. But it's important, because if that clip, which again, CNN still captures more eyeballs than Ars Technica or Vice, right? If that clip had featured someone who was just like, oh yeah, this is really dangerous. It is kind of almost cyberterrorism. You see what I'm saying? The frame really could have had an impact in how Americans saw Anonymous. And it was quite kind of positive frame, and actually one that I tended to see with these attacks. So it was really important that Anonymous supported this, because I think it received a lot of positive associations. Now, what happened next was equally important. Soon after Cablegate, soon after Operation Payback, which was in support of Assange, Anonymous got involved in every major social revolution of 2011 in Tunisia, across the Arab world with the Arab Spring, the Spanish Revolution, and very famously Occupy. And for the case of Occupy, they almost became the kind of propaganda wing. Now, this is important because I think many people don't see these social revolutions as terrorism. Anonymous became associated with many of these revolutions, so it became a little bit harder for them to be tagged as cyber terrorists. Now, had Anonymous only stuck to hacking, let's say, only hacking, and didn't do propaganda and videos and get involved with these other social movements, I think it would have been easier to tag them as cyber terrorists. So, reason number one, the timing and where they got involved. The next one is my favorite example. And it's my favorite example because it's incredibly ironic. It's the adoption of the Guy Fawkes icon. I'm not going to go into the story as to why they adopted it. I can tell you during the Q&A, it's kind of a cool story. As many of you probably know, the icon is associated today with kind of revolutionary action, with dissent. It was used during protests even before Anonymous came into being. But what is fascinating about the Guy Fawkes icon is that Guido Fawkes is an actual historical figure who, in 1605, he tried to murder and overthrow the Protestant king in England. He was a Catholic dissenter. He failed and was killed. But actually, for most of British history, Guy Fawkes was Britain's Osama bin Laden. He was a terrorist. He was a bad guy. The 5th of November, remember, was not like this fun event that it is now for protesters and anarchists in the UK, but it was to commemorate a really awful person. But what happened? How did Guy Fawkes go from awful person, terrorist, Osama, to kind of this cool revolutionary figure, right? Well, some of you are probably thinking, V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, which some of you have probably read, or the film, which tends to really portray Guy Fawkes, not uncontroversially, complicated figure, right? But nevertheless, a kind of positive figure. But what's fascinating about this story of popular culture taking what was a terrorist and transforming him is that it happened a little bit earlier than the 20th century. The first book that took Guy Fawkes and started to portray him as a positive figure was this one, which I'm reading right now. It's called Guy Fawkes or the Gunpowder Treason, a Historical Romance. And indeed, I'm only like 30 pages in, but he's got this mystique already. There's kind of a positive association. This was the first book that actually treated him more as a kind of, at least, not simply as a terrorist, but a complicated figure that had some positive qualities. And what's interesting is that then people who wrote children's books in England started to portray Guy Fawkes in positive terms in children's books. So this story of kind of transforming Guy Fawkes into a positive figure took a long time. And so by the time Anonymous takes on the mask, they take on the positive associations of Guy Fawkes. But I think there's other reasons why the film and graphic novel matter in particular. So who here has read or watched the film? Okay. And for those who haven't, I really suggest both of them. They're very good. But I think what's creepy about both of them is they seem to really match reality today, right? So V for Vendetta tells the story of a really fascist surveillance state. And in the post-Snowden world, we kind of know that while maybe the US and the UK are not quite as fascist as portrayed in the movie, it feels an awful lot like reality in certain ways. And so all of a sudden, having these people take on the mask, which people associate with the movie, and then you have news about surveillance, which matches the movie, all of a sudden the movie becomes a little bit less like fiction. It becomes reality. So quotes from the movie, people should not be afraid of their governments, governments should be afraid of their people, actually stick as kind of true, or ring as true. So what we have is this incredible full circle where you have historical reality, Guy Fawkes trying to blow up the parliament, then re-representation in the arts, film and books and TV, then you have people adopting the image and using it for real protests. And then actually with films like Who Am I and TV shows like Mr. Robot, you again have the re-representation in the arts. And this is a really important dynamic because tell me of an animal rights activist movie, which is like V for Vendetta, where they're like part of our popular culture. It doesn't exist. Popular culture really matters to the story. Okay, reason number 3 has to do with Anonymous's flexibility or incoherence, whatever term you prefer. By this, I mean that Anonymous is often used as a name by very different groups of people for very different causes, right? So it's not simply about hacking or social movements, but it's about fighting rape culture in the United States. It's about fighting police brutality. It's about fighting, the painting over murals in Peru, right? It's kind of all over the place. And some people see this as a weakness. It's like, wow, they really don't know what they're doing because they're doing everything, right? Another example is that there's hacker groups also all over Latin America. Well, I actually think this is a reason why it's harder to tag them as terrorism, because they don't do one thing. They do multiple things. And there's actually a term for this type of political phenomena. It's called a multiple use name. And some people might think that Anonymous is incredibly unique, and it is in certain ways. But this multiple use name, where there is a general alias that can be used by different groups, has quite a few examples. There's quite a few examples in the world. 2 of the most famous are Luther Blissett, which was created, a fake fictional figure was created by a bunch of Italian activists in the 1990s. And then the name and icon spread all over Europe, and different activists all over Europe would take the name Luther Blissett to lay claim, especially to pranks. An older example has to do with Captain Swing, which was taken by farmers all over England in the 1830s to protest the introduction of new machinery that they felt was threatening their livelihood. So a lot of actions were signed, Captain Swing, I'm Captain Swing, I'm Captain Swing. So in the case of Anonymous, the fact that you can use it for these multiple things means it's a little bit hard to say, well, they're just about terrorism, because the name is used for many different things. Now, another reason why I think Anonymous is actually seen in a semi-positive way, not a totally positive way, but semi-positive way, has to do with their symbolism. So Anonymous is used to engage in many different forms of political action, but all its symbolism has to do with anonymity. Its name is anonymous. Its other kind of main icon is the headless suit person. And one of the things I think is really fascinating is that, again, while Anonymous is very controversial, I've met many people who love Anonymous, others who hate Anonymous, others who are like, I sort of like some of the things they do and I hate other things, right? Controversial. But I think one of the things that people appreciate about Anonymous generally is that it does feel like we've lost the right to privacy and anonymity in this world due to surveillance, due to tracking. And here's this phenomena that symbolizes the importance of anonymity. And so I think that there's some kind of positive associations that have come about because of this. Now, another reason has to do with terrorists, ISIS. One of the fascinating things and scary things is that ISIS really came into being very strongly around the same time that Anonymous came into being very strongly. A little bit later, but around the same time. And one of the things that is fascinating about ISIS is that, like Anonymous, they use social media like crazy, right? They're on Twitter, they create videos, and they really started to circulate stuff around 2012. Well, I think the general population, if they saw an Anonymous video where you had like a guy wearing a Guy Fawkes mask making an announcement, and then saw an ISIS video with someone being beheaded, all of a sudden Anonymous looks pretty tame, So in a weird way, I think the circulation of ISIS propaganda helped Anonymous because it was so easy to kind of differentiate the two. And then when Anonymous actually then started to engage in Operation ISIS, where they started to fight the terrorists, and this had many different iterations, and it's kind of a crazy operation, which I'm not going to go into. Nevertheless, this also helped, especially because the super mainstream press, CNN, CBS, they loved that Anonymous was fighting terrorists, right? And so this was from CBS, who said the Hacker Collective had a year full of headlines and trending hashtags in 2015. This was the year the shadowy group seemed determined to make its mark by going after a target that people could universally rally against ISIS. So, now I have one more reason why I think it was hard to make this association stick. It has to do with a single event. So, it's a slightly longer example, so let me set it up. In January 2012, governments all over the world, they were considering the ratification of a US-led trade proposal, ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeit Trade Agreement. Now, many people were against ACTA because they felt like it would cut into the freedoms of the internet. It was too oriented towards copyright. And so there was a lot of protests in Europe, especially against ACTA. Now, Anonymous also launched an operation called Operation Anti-ACTA. Welcome to Operation Anti-ACTA. The video went, we encourage you to spread the word of anti-ACTA far and wide. The top priority is to steal and leak any classified government information, including emails and documentation. Prime targets are Polish government websites and other high-ranking establishments. Now, the reason why they were targeting Poland was very specific. The Polish public was very much against ACTA. There were 10,000 people who showed up on the streets to protest ACTA in this time period. So, what happened next was amazing. You had the protests on the streets. You had Anonymous that was DDoSing the Polish government websites. And then something very unexpected happened. On January 26, 2012, while casting their votes in Parliament, some members of the Polish government concealed their faces with paper Guy Fawkes masks. And here's another image. At the height of an Anonymous campaign, government officials had adopted their symbol. One Anonymous activist blogged about the importance of this act. He wrote, Anonymous is not unanimous. An opinion on DDoS is perhaps more divided than any other tactic. Indeed, this very faction, in consultation with anti-ACTA NGOs, had been calling for a halt to DDoS for the last several days. But after this photo of Polish politicians protesting ACTA went viral yesterday, it's time we all reevaluate the role and legitimacy of DDoS. These parliamentarians were wearing Anonymous Guy Fawkes masks while the Parliament's website was down due to a DDoS by Anonymous. I can't emphasize the point enough. This is a game changer. And indeed, I think it was a game changer, not simply because it legitimated DDoS, but because it legitimated Anonymous. This was the first time that government officials in a government chamber had taken on this icon that was really associated with Anonymous at this point, right? Well, now this is where I reveal the surprise of the talk. So remember that Wall Street Journal article that I talked about earlier, where Keith Alexander had kind of claimed that Anonymous had the capability of engaging in an attack against critical infrastructure? It came 2 weeks after the Polish parliamentarians took on the mask. I have no way of kind of proving this, but I think that they are related. I feel like this was the government's last-ditch effort to kind of vilify Anonymous right at the moment they were losing the battle, right? Of course, I'll never know this. Maybe I'll write a historical romance about it or something. But nevertheless, I think this was the association. So now I'm really going to wrap up because I have given you my reasons why I think Anonymous was able to evade this. But why does this matter? What does this have to do with you guys? Well, I think this matters for a number of reasons. First of all, that Wall Street Journal article was questioned by a lot of security researchers and hackers. And I think this is important. If there's a lot of bullshit that's being circulated, right? You don't have to agree with Anonymous, but I think it's important to speak up and say what's possible, what's not possible, what's right, and what's wrong. And I actually think what's interesting about the hacker community is that they may be very divided over hacktivism, but I do admire people for speaking up. I admire that people note that today the cyber squirrel is responsible for more power outages, for example, than attacks, right? And the scary thing, and this is something that I think a lot of security professionals do know, is that our infrastructure is vulnerable to attack, right? I'm not saying it's not. It absolutely is vulnerable to attack. But as everyone here knows, attribution can be very hard, and it can be very easy to misattribute a cyber attack against critical infrastructure to basically vilify an entire political movement. And so that's something to consider. Another point is that you don't need to have the cyberterrorism frame to kind of stamp out political dissent. So just as the SHAC 7 were jailed for a long time for running a website, well, in Anonymous, we have the case of Barrett Brown, who was a journalist who could not hack himself out of a paper bag if he wanted to, who basically was jailed for 5 years because he associated with the hackers, because he took information and reported on it. It's a complicated case. If you don't know about it, I encourage people to read about it. But this is interesting. You don't need the frame in some ways to like stamp things out. The other thing that is interesting is that symbols like the Guy Fawkes mask are really open to reinterpretation, right? I mean, it's a great story. You go from like this evil figure to a revolutionary figure, and all of us have a role to play in this kind of reconfiguration. But one thing is certain, the terrorism frame is one that the government tends to hold a monopoly on, right? So on the one hand, they can very easily tag groups as terrorists, but when the American government says we kill people based on metadata, as the ex-CIA NSA director has admitted, you might think, wow, that's terrifying. That may be terrorism. It might be a good example of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Yet there's an unequal playing field, right? So symbols are up for reinterpretation, but the terrorism label is one that it's very difficult, I think, for citizens to reclaim. So just to finish, I think we are in a very interesting moment. We're in a moment where hacktivists like Anonymous are being represented in popular culture. We have figures like Snowden, Assange, and Chelsea Manning who are being memorialized in statues. This is in Berlin. There's a big film about Snowden coming out soon. And, you know, I don't think it's important for everyone to support hacktivist action, right? They do different things. People have different beliefs about them. But I do think it's important that they don't get tagged as cyber terrorists, because if they do, a lot of the important leaks and political interventions that we've been seeing in the last 5 years will all of a sudden become polluted and marginalized and ghettoized. And I think it is absolutely a realistic future that one day I'll be giving a talk at NSEC in 5 years, and instead of giving this talk, I'll give a different talk where I say, you know, there was this moment between 2010 and 15 where Anonymous evaded this frame, but from 15 to 220, they got trapped by it. So let's just make sure we do what we can to avoid this association. And I think I will leave it at that. And there's just maybe 5 to 10 minutes left for questions. So thank you very much.